I never imagined a short visit to my ancestral village would uncover something that still sends shivers down my spine. I was just looking for a break from the chaotic city life, but what I encountered was far beyond the realm of anything I could have prepared for. It began with an old letter. While sorting through a stack of ancient books in our storeroom, I stumbled across it. It was written in Bengali, the script slightly faded, but the handwriting delicate, almost poetic. It was addressed to someone named Bulbul. My curiosity piqued. Who was she? Why had I never heard of her? When I asked my grandmother about the name, she went quiet, her face clouding over with unease. "Let the past stay buried," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I pressed her for answers, but she refused to speak further. Her fear was palpable, and it only made me want to know more. Later that evening, as I strolled through the village, the air seemed heavier than usual. The villagers I spoke to grew visibly uncomfortable at the mention of Bulbul's name. "It's better you don't ask," one elderly man warned, glancing nervously at the forest that bordered the village. "The Haveli, the one on the hill, don't go there." The Haveli. I had seen it earlier, perched like a forgotten ghost on the hill, its silhouette sharp against the twilight sky. Abandoned and decrepit, it seemed to hold secrets too heavy to share. Against all warnings, I decided to visit the place the next day. How could I not? Something about the name Bulbul, the letter, and the villagers' reluctance drew me in like a moth to a flame. The next morning, I made my way to the Haveli. The path was overgrown, the trees dense and towering, as though nature itself was trying to keep intruders out. As I reached the gates, I hesitated. The air around the Haveli was eerily still, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The front door was unlocked, creaking open with an almost mournful sound. Inside, the Haveli was a shadow of its former self. Grand chandeliers hung precariously, faded portraits stared back at me with lifeless eyes, and the walls whispered stories of a bygone era. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. And then I found it, a room unlike the others. It was well preserved, almost as if someone had been taking care of it. In the center stood a large wooden trunk. Inside, I found letters, jewelry, and a diary. The diary belonged to Bulbul. Her story unfolded in those fragile pages. She was married off as a child bride to the zamindar of the Haveli, a man much older than her. The diary spoke of her loneliness, her longing for freedom, and the only solace she found, the younger brother of the zamindar, Satya. He was kind, unlike the others. They shared stories, laughter, and a bond that was pure. But, as I read further, the pages grew darker. Bulbul wrote of her husband's growing suspicion and jealousy. One day, when Satya left for the city, she was brutally punished, her ankles were broken, and she was confined to the Haveli. The diary ended abruptly after that. But it wasn't the end of her story. That night, the villagers told me, strange things began to happen. A shadow, they said, roamed the forest. Men who dared to hurt women met gruesome ends. They whispered that it was Bulbul's spirit, protecting the women of the village, avenging those who suffered. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I walked back from the Haveli. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, haunting melody, like a lullaby. It seemed to come from the direction of the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The forest was alive with an eerie glow, the moonlight filtering through the trees. And then I saw her. A woman in a red sari, her hair flowing like a river of shadows, her feet didn't touch the ground. She turned to look at me, and I froze. Her eyes weren't human, they glowed like embers, burning with an intensity one couldn't comprehend. "Bulbul," I whispered. She smiled, a smile that was both kind and chilling. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't answer, my throat dry and heart racing. She laughed softly, a sound that echoed in the silence. "Go back," she said. "This is not your fight." The next thing I remember, I was back in my room, drenched in sweat, the scent of jasmine lingering in the air. I don't know if it was a dream or if I truly met her. But one thing is certain, I left the village the very next day, and I've never gone back. Bulbul's story isn't just a tale, it's a reminder. A reminder of the pain and injustice buried in the past, of voices silenced too soon, and of the strength that rises in their wake. Even now, when the nights are quiet, I sometimes hear that haunting melody and wonder, did I really leave the village behind, or has a part of it stayed with me forever? There are moments in life you can never forget. Not because they're beautiful, but because they haunt you. This is one of those stories. Even now, years later, I struggle to put it into words, but I'll try. Maybe sharing it will help me make sense of what happened. It all began with an old family property, a crumbling ancestral house deep in the heart of Kerala. I'd always heard stories about it growing up. My father used to call it the cursed house, but I never paid much attention. It was just folklore, I thought. But when I inherited it after my uncle passed, I had no choice but to visit. The house was in shambles. The walls were covered in moss, the wooden beams sagged, and the air reeked of decay. But what struck me most was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the house was alive and waiting for something or someone. The villagers were no help. When I asked them about the house, their faces darkened. "You shouldn't have come here," one elderly man said, his voice trembling. "Leave before it's too late." His words only fueled my curiosity. What were they so afraid of? The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the wind carried whispers I couldn't quite make out. I brushed it off as my imagination. But then the dreams started. They were vivid, more real than anything I'd ever experienced. In the dreams, I was someone else, a man named Brahmadatta, living in this very house centuries ago. He was a healer, respected and feared for his knowledge of Ayurveda and the occult. But something changed. The dreams showed him performing rituals, dark and horrifying, using human bones and chanting in an ancient language. His face, which initially seemed kind, grew twisted with malevolence. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I tried to dismiss it as a nightmare, but the dreams kept coming, each one darker than the last. And then, I started finding things in the house, objects I'd seen in my dreams. A rusted ceremonial knife, jars filled with herbs that had long since turned to dust, and a book. The book was the worst. Its pages were filled with handwritten rituals, each more grotesque than the last. The writing wasn't in a script I knew, yet I could read it as if it were my mother tongue. One entry caught my attention, a ritual to conquer death. It required sacrifices, human sacrifices. My blood ran cold. Was Brahmadatta trying to achieve immortality? And if he had failed, why was his story so vivid in my dreams? As the days passed, I noticed the house changing. At night, the walls seemed to pulse, and I could hear faint chanting, though I was alone. The shadows in the corners grew darker, almost tangible. One night, as I stood in the living room, I saw it, a figure. He was tall, gaunt, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. It was Brahmadatta. He stared at me, a cruel smile playing on his lips, as if mocking me. And then, he vanished. The villagers refused to help. "You've awakened him," they said. "He's been waiting for someone like you." I didn't understand what they meant until I started noticing the changes in myself. My skin grew pale, my appetite vanished, and I started hearing his voice in my head, whispering, urging me to complete the rituals he had started centuries ago. I tried to leave the house, but every time I stepped outside, I found myself back at the front door. It was as if the house wouldn't let me go. Desperation took over, and I began scouring the book for a way to end this nightmare. That's when I found it, a ritual to banish a spirit bound to a place. But it required something precious, a life. The thought of taking a life sickened me, but I didn't have a choice. If I didn't do it, I'd become like him, trapped in this house, consumed by darkness. One stormy night, I prepared for the ritual. The air was thick with the smell of burning herbs, and the chanting in the walls grew louder, more frantic. As I lit the final candle, Brahmadatta appeared again. He didn't try to stop me, he just watched, his smile growing wider. When the ritual was complete, there was a deafening silence. And then, the house began to shake. The walls cracked, the floor splintered, and I felt an intense heat, as if the house itself was burning from the inside out. Brahmadatta let out a scream, a sound so inhuman it made my ears bleed, and then he was gone. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the village, the house a smoldering ruin behind me. The villagers looked at me with a mix of fear and pity. "It's over," the old man said. "But you'll never be free." He was right. Even now, I hear Brahmadatta's voice in my dreams. He's waiting, biding his time. And every time I look in the mirror, I see him, just for a moment, but long enough to know that the darkness hasn't let go of me. So here I am, telling you this story, not for sympathy or understanding, but as a warning. Some doors should never be opened, some stories should never be uncovered. And if you ever find yourself in an old house, with whispers in the walls and shadows that move on their own, leave. Leave before it's too late. There are times when the weight of the past feels like an anchor, dragging you down into darkness. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural until I lived through what I'm about to tell you. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel it lurking in the corners of my memory. It all started when my mother fell ill. She wasn't the same after my father passed away. The grief changed her, made her withdrawn and irritable. Doctors called it depression, but it felt like something more, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. To help her recover, I moved back to our family home, a small, aging house on the outskirts of the city. The house had always been strange. My grandfather had built it decades ago, and it had a history no one liked to talk about. I'd spent my childhood there, but after my father's death, I avoided it as much as possible. Returning to that house felt like walking into a tomb. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the heavy, suffocating air, the creak of floorboards that seemed to echo too loudly, the way shadows lingered in corners even during the day. I told myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The first few nights were uneventful, apart from the tension between me and my mother. She hardly spoke, staring blankly at the walls or muttering to herself. I tried to connect with her, but she pushed me away, her mood swinging between apathy and bursts of anger. It was exhausting, and I began to feel the isolation creeping in. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was my mother talking in her sleep. But when I went to check on her, she was sound asleep, her door locked from the inside. The whispers continued, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I followed the sound to the kitchen, but the moment I stepped inside, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and the air felt colder than it should have. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. A chair that had been tucked under the table was now pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there. Things escalated quickly after that. My mother began acting even stranger, staring at empty spaces as if she could see something I couldn't. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice trembling, saying things like, "They're watching," or "Don't go into the storeroom." The storeroom. It was a small, dusty space at the back of the house, filled with old furniture, suitcases, and things my grandparents had left behind. I hadn't thought much about it until my mother's warnings. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, when she was asleep, I unlocked the storeroom and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the room smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. As I rummaged through the clutter, I found an old photograph tucked inside a trunk. It was of my grandparents, standing outside the house with a man I didn't recognize. His face was strange, almost blurry, like it didn't belong in the picture. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I began hearing faint footsteps outside my door. The next morning, I confronted my mother. "What's wrong with this house?" I demanded. She refused to answer, her eyes darting nervously toward the storeroom. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I started digging through old family records and learned something chilling. Decades ago, before my grandparents built the house, the land had been the site of a mental asylum. Patients had been treated cruelly, and several had died there under mysterious circumstances. One of the doctors, a man named Dr. Narayan, had been accused of experimenting on patients, but he disappeared before he could be arrested. As I read about the asylum, the house seemed to come alive around me. Doors creaked open on their own, shadows moved where there was no light, and the whispers turned into low, guttural murmurs. My mother grew more agitated, begging me to leave, saying, "He's here." He never left. One night, everything came to a head. I woke up to find my mother standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide with terror. "They've taken him," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, she ran out of the room. I followed her to the storeroom. She stood frozen, staring at the door, which was slightly ajar. "Don't go in," she said, her voice trembling. But I couldn't stop myself. Inside, the room was darker than it should have been, as if the light couldn't penetrate it. And then I saw him. A figure stood in the corner, his face obscured but his presence overwhelming. He didn't move, but I felt his gaze pierce through me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the air grew colder. I could hear my mother screaming from the other side, but her voice seemed distant. The figure stepped closer, and I finally saw his face. It was the man from the photograph. Dr. Narayan. He whispered something I couldn't understand, his voice a chilling mix of anger and sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. The next day, my mother and I left the house. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. We never went back, and the house now sits abandoned, a shell of its former self. Even now, I hear whispers in my dreams, and sometimes, I see his face in the shadows. I don't know what he wanted or why he chose to haunt us. But one thing is certain, some places carry the weight of the past, and once you step into them, they never let you go. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video to show your support and help us create more content like this. Share it with your friends and family who love thrilling and spooky tales. Comment below your thoughts, theories, or your own scary experiences. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to TerraFlix and hit the bell icon to never miss a chilling story. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling adventures.